You've wondered about this place. You've imagined its blank walls and the sound of madness as those around you suffer from things you don't yet know how to imagine. Tonight I'm taking you deep into the psychiatric ward, beyond what you've seen in movies. I've collected stories that they don't want you to hear, first-hand accounts, strange events, and whispers from deep inside padded rooms. So find somewhere safe, dim the lights, but don't get too comfortable. You wouldn't want to stay here too long. This is the story of a nothing trigger. I worked in a military hospital, and I loved my job. Basically, I just got to visit and check on patients all through the hospital. I wasn't a doctor or a nurse. I didn't practice medicine. Instead, I would talk to them, make sure they were focused on recovering and not thinking about whatever put them in the hospital. Occasionally, they would be so messed up from combat wounds that they couldn't talk to me at all. But I still talked to them, and I sat with them. Now let me remind you that not all combat wounds are physical, and sometimes the injuries are much deeper than flesh. One evening I was sent to the psych ward to visit an officer that had a mental break. I'd only been once before, and that was just to escort a patient to the ward, not to actually visit anyone. The door to the floor can only be opened from the outside, but once in, you have to check in with the nurses, then be buzzed out by one of them. So I walked in no problem, and as soon as the doors closed, I realized I forgot my clipboard with all the patient's information, and I immediately knew that leaving just to come back was going to be a tedious hassle. As I stood there contemplating on what to do, a very stern-looking woman in uniform came up to me and asked me what I was doing on the floor, since regular visitors aren't allowed. I explained that I was coming to see a patient, but she grilled me for not having any paperwork to back this up. And anyone who's been in the military knows that when a lecture starts, you just have to stand there and let it happen. She asked for my identification badge, but that too was currently sitting on my clipboard in the shared office. I had completely spaced out for this visit, and she was tearing into me for it. She stood there and lectured me about how irresponsible I was for leaving the paperwork back at the offices downstairs. She asked me if I even cared about my patients. She asked how could they trust me when I couldn't trust myself to come prepared. And she was clearly an authority figure, and she was well versed in chewing out the low ranks. She laid into me for a solid 5 minutes before she took a breath and finally just asked who I was here to see. I told her all I knew about the patient was that she was an officer and had some kind of mental break yesterday, and nobody knows why. She was only admitted last night, and she was still experiencing psychosis. I didn't even know her name. But the woman's face dropped. She took a step back from me and looked around as if she was realizing where she was for the first time. At first, I thought she was looking for my patient. Then I noticed that she didn't have any ranking insignia on her collar. All of us wear our ranks pinned to our collars, but on the psych ward, all patients have sharp objects removed. It felt like some big movie twist as I realized she was my patient all along. And in that moment, it was like she was hearing it for the first time. She didn't say anything at first. She walked over to the couch and sat down, then looked at her hands. Since I was no longer being ripped by someone that outranked me, I went to the nurse's station and they told me that she keeps forgetting she's in the ward and she has to be reminded. I went to the sitting area and I asked her if she knew where she was. She was no longer the harsh, strict woman I had just met. She spoke softly and sadly. And what's worse is that she was totally aware of herself now. She said she was fine yesterday. Nothing bad had happened. Nothing horrible had triggered her. She said 1 minute she was talking to her husband and the next minute, it was like someone else was living in her body with her. Nothing triggered her brain to break. Yet suddenly she went from a normal, everyday woman to living in the psych ward. She said that she could see faces all around her. She could hear her own thoughts, but they weren't hers. She said she couldn't stop thinking about breathing and would have to tell herself to breathe in and out, while the voices told her that she didn't need to breathe at all. She said that she was forgetting her own name, forgetting her birthday, and it felt like she never existed. She felt like she was here when she wasn't supposed to be. It was terrifying listening to her, because she was acutely aware of every part of her mental break, and she had absolutely no idea what had caused it. She sounded intelligent and calm, and while she explained how her life had been normal 24 hours ago, all I could do was listen. She said it would make sense if something drastic had happened, but she was just talking to her husband 1 minute. Then she was screaming at the walls because they were laughing at her. When she started crying, it broke my heart. I'm used to telling people, I'm sorry you got blown up, or I'm sorry you were wounded in combat and nearly didn't make it back. But how do you tell someone, I'm sorry that your brain just flicked a switch and stopped working properly? I sat with her for a bit, just listening. Then she trailed off and went from telling me about her kids to telling me that her hands used to belong to someone else. And I knew that she was gone. I couldn't stay any longer, so I got up to leave, and another patient, this one wearing the traditional robe, said he wanted to show me something. I looked at a nurse nearby, and she nodded at me, so I knew that this guy was harmless. And he didn't go far, just to the opposite wall, and he showed me the fire escape plan that hung framed on the wall. He said, I'm getting out soon. They don't think I can see the map, but I can. And all I said was, okay. And I headed for the door. I got buzzed out, and when the doors closed behind me, I felt more afraid than I'd ever felt before. Because I'd seen patients without arms and legs, with burns and bullet wounds. But this was my first time seeing patients without their sanity. And it was horrifying. The story is about a movie. Sometimes that's all it takes. My brother admitted himself to the ward under a voluntary hold after going 3 days without sleep. He said he was watching a movie and it broke him. He told me it wasn't even a scary movie, it wasn't that deep, and it didn't even have anything about it that was extraordinary, yet for whatever reason, he watched it and he couldn't get it out of his head. The movie? Skinamarink. The shocking thing to me is that he actually managed to watch the whole thing. I've tried it before, and for me, it was one of the worst movies I'd ever seen, so I've never even finished it. I'm not going to waste time dragging it through the mud, but if you know, you know. But for whatever reason, this movie triggered something in my brother's brain, and it affected him really badly. I don't actually know the steps he took to get himself into the facility. I just know that one day I got a call from my mom, and she asked me to visit him. It was a chilling experience because while everyone inside looked normal, I knew that they were only inside because something was wrong with them. I didn't know which patients were simply depressed, maybe anxious. I didn't know which ones were just a touch crazy, or which ones were dangerous. But I knew that my brother was among them, so I immediately felt sorry for all of them. I found my brother sitting on a couch by himself, and he looked so bored that I found it hard to process the idea of him going through a crisis. I asked him how he was feeling. He said he was fine, but he was just bored sitting around. I asked him if the food was good, and he said it was surprisingly mid. I asked if he gets to at least watch some TV, and I shouldn't have said that because his face changed. Now he looked concerned, and he asked, "You didn't watch the movie, did you?" I thought about lying to him and saying, "No, of course not." But I decided he needed to know the truth, that the movie sucked and had no effect on me whatsoever. So I told him that. And he looked shocked, like I had just told him something ridiculous and impossible. He looked away from me, huffed once, then looked back at me and asked, "You don't feel anything? You aren't thinking about it all the time?" I was brutally honest, and I said, "No, the movie is absolute garbage." And I told him I couldn't make it through 30 minutes of it without nearly falling asleep. Then my brother stood up, and he called me a liar. He shouted that there was no way that was true. I saw a few guards or nurses, whatever they are, start to come to us, but I stood up and tried to calm him down by saying, "I'm not lying, it's just a movie. It's barely a movie." But the help came to us and asked if we were all right. I told them we were, and after a minute of standing awkwardly, my brother also said that everything was fine. The rest of the visit was as smooth as it could be after such an event. And after 2 weeks, he got out. He called me about a month later and asked me to help him watch the movie again. I basically begged him not to, because of what it had done to him already. But he assured me that he had to see it again, to overcome what it did to him. I agreed, just so he wouldn't do it without me. He came to my house, and we put on Skinamarink. He watched it while I watched him, waiting for him to crack and panic. But to my relief, about 30 or 40 minutes in, he shook his head and he said, "Jesus, this movie sucks." We laughed, but I was still worried that he didn't mean it. Finally, I realized he was telling the truth because he started to pick apart the movie, and he sounded so normal. He sounded like my brother again. We didn't finish watching it because it was so bad. We just went to dinner, had a beer, and he went home. He's been fine since, and we don't talk about it because he's embarrassed by it. Now, this was the best outcome, of course, but it's chilling to me that a movie literally broke my brother's mind for a while. I actually think about it every time I'm about to watch a movie. It's a nagging feeling that whatever I'm about to watch could flip a switch in my brain, and I'd never see it coming. The story is about a room that should remain closed. On the 8th floor of a rather large hospital, I'm not going to name, lies the psychiatric ward. The patients are treated well, and the facility has cutting-edge equipment and a brilliant staff. It's the ideal place to work, and if you're going to be admitted, it's definitely a safe place to be during a crisis. As long as room 4B stays sealed. I was new to being an MHT, which means mental health tech. Basically the front line of staff on the floor. I had to check on patients, assist the nurses, the doctors, keep detailed reports on patients, and even help subdue patients when needed. But on this floor, that never really happened. Everything and everyone was calm. The job itself is a lot for anyone to do, which is why the turnover rate is so high. I caught on pretty quickly to my new position, and I was told that I was great with the patients, and I was able to quickly build a rapport with them. It seemed that the patients liked to open up to me more, since they see me as a regular Joe and not a doctor or nurse. After a few weeks, I was handling all of my tasks well, and I felt comfortable enough to look beyond my scope and try to see more of the ward. Basically, every staff member has their section, and we stick to our spots. But I wanted to make myself invaluable by learning more than just my section. I wanted to know the ins and outs of the whole floor. I had heard about room 4B, but only hushed whispers that ended abruptly when I came close. It was like everyone knew some big secret but wouldn't come out and say it. Now all this was strange because nobody was in room 4B, ever. The logs were empty and the room was always locked. I'd never even seen someone so much as open the door to clean the room. One night while the patients slept and the other members of the staff tended to their duties, I wandered the hall, peeking into patients' room to make sure they were asleep, and they were, all of them in their beds. This night was just like all the others, calm and quiet, simple and easy. For whatever reason, as I walked the halls, all I could think about was room 4B. I really wanted to go in it and see what the fuss was about. I wanted to ask someone about it, but it felt like asking about a big scar on someone's face. Everyone can see it. Everyone knows about it. Nobody talks about it. Curiosity got the best of me, and I went to the nurse's station and saw that the key wasn't even on the key ring. Every other room had a key on this ring, but not 4B. And this felt like a direct challenge, and I spent about 15 minutes looking around the nurse's station for the key. Finally, I discovered it, taped inside of a drawer. Now, it felt like I was actually doing something wrong. Like maybe it was structurally dangerous. Maybe it was falling apart. But these feelings didn't stop me from looking. With nobody else around me, I went to 4B, unlocked the door, and opened it. As the door creaked a little bit from unused hinges, I was surprised to see that despite the hushed whispers and the taboo, it was just a room, like all the others. It had a bed, a soft chair, a desk, a lamp. It was nothing special. It appeared to be exactly like every other room on the ward, and I couldn't for the life of me understand why this one remained locked, sealed up tight from any wandering eyes. I just stood there with no idea what made this room so special. Then I heard a scream, A hard, frigid scream like someone had just seen the devil himself. I ran out of the room full speed to the source of the screaming to see that some of the other mental health techs had already reached the room. The howling was so animal, so unhinged and wild that it made my arm hairs stand up. Then came another scream, and another, and one by one the patients on the floor began to scream like some terrible domino effect of horror. It took us nearly 2 hours to calm all of the patients down enough just to get them back to sleep. When it was over, the techs and the nurses grouped together to discuss what the hell happened. We were all standing in a huddle when the head nurse joined us and very quietly spoke. She asked in a low voice, "Who opened the door?" Nobody said anything. We all just looked at each other curiously and waited for someone to admit to opening a door, and I thought she meant the first patient's room, so I said nothing. The nurse took a breath, a frustrated moment to calm herself, and she said, "4B was open, I just had to close it." And I felt a sudden jerk in my stomach. It was me. I'd been in such a hurry to help the screaming patient that I had left the room open. But I had no idea how the two were related, so I admitted it. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that everyone looked at me like I had just brought a snake into the office. I almost felt like they were going to step back from me. The head nurse, to my surprise, just told everyone else to disperse. And when it was just the two of us, she seemed almost hesitant to talk to me. But her features softened, and she said, "You're new here, so I'm guessing nobody told you about 4B. And I just shook my head no. She sighed and said, 4B stays locked, always. Under no circumstances does that door open again. I said okay, but I had to ask what 4B had to do with what just happened. She said, when that door opens, things just happen. Things go wrong. Patients react negatively. We've gotten used to pretending it doesn't exist, but someone should have told you not to go near that room. And she didn't elaborate further. She didn't punish me in any way. We all just went back to work like nothing happened. A few weeks later, I was close enough to the other techs that I was able to ask them directly about room 4B. They told me that the room was wrong. It was unnatural. They said very plainly that the room was just evil, and even walking by it made them feel uneasy. None of them knew what had caused it. None of them had a good story or a good reason for the room to be the way it was, but they knew to avoid it. They told me they were surprised that I had actually opened the door, and they said that the whole time they had worked there, not once were they curious about that room. They even suggested that the room had made me do it, which sounded like the plot to some scary movie. I didn't tell them that I wasn't afraid of the room at all. I didn't say it freaked me out, and I definitely didn't tell them that I had just wanted to open the door and go inside. And truth be told, I still want to. This story is about a girl in a hallway. I debated on talking about the story at all, but the story of the wandering girl is just too good not to tell people about. I worked check-in on the psych floor, a very easy clerical kind of job. I didn't deal with patients unless they came up to me, and the only ones able to wander that close to me were the harmless ones. One evening, it was about 5 p.m., December something, so nothing was visible outside the windows. I was sitting at the desk, and I knew we didn't have any intakes today, so I was organizing files, doing some paperwork for the nurses, and more or less just pittering around, staying busy. I was in the zone, but from the corner of my eye, I see someone coming down the hallway to my right, and I look over to see Susie walking slowly in my direction. Susie was admitted a week ago. She didn't talk or do anything weird, so I just smiled and went back to work since she was a good ways away from me. I kept working, still in the zone, and I was able to get a ton of work done, but when I flicked my eyes down to see the time, it was already 6 p.m. I stretched and noticed something in the hall, so I looked over and Susie was in the hall again, walking towards me. She was much further back than before, and I didn't really think anything of it. Maybe she just liked to walk. I went to the vending machine in the nurse's station, got a soda, and when I came back to my desk, Susie was walking right in front of my desk. She didn't say anything to me, and I didn't say anything to her. She's a patient, and I'm not really qualified to ask any questions, You never know what could set them off. So I'm working again. It's somehow darker in the lobby, like the lights had dimmed when I knew they couldn't have. It felt like the winter darkness was somehow creeping inside the building. And I was thinking this right when I looked up from my computer to see Susie walking down the hall again. Walking slowly to me. And I can't explain why, but it made me anxious, and I felt like she was walking to me, not just in my direction. I decided to stop thinking about her and just get my work done. I was now transcribing notes into the database. Another hour went by, and I see movement to my side. I look over and Susie is somehow further back, but still walking towards me. It was like she was on some endless track that was repeating itself, and no matter how close she got, she just had to restart her walk. I was over it, so I watched her for a bit, and it took her at least 10 minutes to walk down the hall and past my desk. I kept my eyes on her the entire time. She was being weird, which for a mental health floor is normal, but still, when she was out of sight, that's when I went back to work. Not even 10 minutes later, I jerked my head because I see Susie about halfway through the hall yet again. She's not actually doing anything wrong, but it's so uncomfortable for me that I got up and went to one of the nurses I knew well. I just asked her nicely if she could see if Susie needed help, since she might be having some kind of episode that makes her walk the hall nonstop. The nurse looked at me. With very clear confusion, I knew that something was up, so I asked her. She said that Susie had been transferred this morning and shouldn't be here. I didn't panic. I just got up and saw the nurse follow me, so we went to the lobby where my desk was. And of course the hall was empty. I just shook my head and told the nurse what I had seen, and that the cameras would prove it. You know, I was actually justified when Susie appeared on camera, walking down the hallway ever so slowly. The nurse was surprised enough that she just left the desk and went looking down the hall. Both of us did. Then we checked every single room, and all we found were the patients that were supposed to be there. The nurse was taking this seriously, so she called the hospital that Susie was transferred to, and they told us they had her. This wasn't enough for my nurse, so she demanded they go physically put eyes on her. And after a few minutes, the person on the phone assured us that they had seen and spoke to Susie just now. This is when it got weirder because we went back to the camera and checked. Now the file was corrupt. It wouldn't load at all, and there was no way to restore it. We checked all the rooms on the floor again for Susie, but she wasn't there. And all proof of her was gone too. But at least someone else saw her on video. So I knew it wasn't just me going crazy. This story is a little different. This was told to me by my dad. I guess his friend worked in a psych ward for a short time, and he shared this story as one of the worst things he'd ever seen. Unfortunately, I could hear in his voice that it really stuck with him. So if physical violence freaks you out, you might be best to skip this one. About 20 years ago, the psych ward was a hard place. It was filled with cigarette smoke and the sounds of patients crying out for help, while the staff was overworked, undertrained, or maybe they just didn't really care about their patients. Whatever the case was, it was still the only place for mental health. So a middle-aged man visited the psych floor of the hospital and requested to be admitted. He told the nurse in charge that he felt he was going to hurt someone and wouldn't be able to control himself any longer. He asked her point blank, "Please, don't let me hurt anyone." Now try to realize that back then, 20 or so years ago, healthcare was different. Self-care and mental health wasn't a priority. So when this guy tried to admit himself, he was told by the head nurse that since he didn't have a referral from his doctor, he couldn't be admitted. And she wasn't sincere or apologetic about any of this. She was dismissive and acted like this man was an inconvenience to whatever she was doing. He stood there, at a loss for words because it had probably taken everything he had just to bring himself there and try to isolate himself from the general public. He was devastated and afraid of what was going to happen. In an attempt to get the man to leave, the nurse in charge told him to have a good night, and she got up from her desk, walked around the corner and walked past him, trying her best to pretend that the man wasn't there. Unfortunately for her, the man was telling the truth when he said that he was going to hurt someone. He couldn't help himself. He could no longer stop himself. As she brushed past him the same way she brushed off his request, the man picked up the heavy glass ashtray from the counter and struck the nurse over the head with it. No matter how many times he hit her, the heavy glass ashtray never broke. It took 3 guards, including my dad's friend, to get the man off of her, and by then she was barely alive. They sedated him and put him in isolation while the nurse was sent to the emergency room on the ground floor. She was unable to ever return to work, and the man got exactly what he wanted. He was admitted and kept in isolation for as long as my dad's friend worked there. That man never apologized, but he never spoke or acted violently again. He actually was always kind and was very friendly to all of the staff. The thing is that he knew he was going to hurt someone, and all he wanted was to put himself somewhere safe before that happened. Now, I feel sorry for the nurse, but at the same time, she had the power to save herself and others from her fate. So what do you think? Was that man a monster for what he did? Or was she a victim of her own actions? I hope you enjoyed listening to these 5 creepy stories about the psych ward. And know that these were just stories I found. These are not the normal. So if you ever feel like you need help, don't be afraid to reach out to a mental health professional. They are trained to help you, and they will. Now, as for Gloom Station, I want to say thank you to everyone that has subscribed. It means a lot to me. And if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and leave a comment telling me which story you liked the most. Or just say hello. I like when people say hello. Click the videos on screen now for more content. Stay safe out there, and good night.